to the class. Hi, everybody. This is the Art of Fiction. We are on week number 3. This is our second to last class. And I'm very, very excited to be with all of you. And those of you that were unable to make the class today, we miss you. And I really hope you come to the last class. I'm hoping to connect you, pair you off. I do this accountability thing where I will pair you with another writer and just like create some accountability for the story that we're working on and revisions. And so I hope everybody comes to the last class, but if not, then you'll get an email from me just connecting you to each other. So for today, the plan for today, we only have one writer who sent us a short story. Thank you, Sherry. And Sherry's been sick, so she's a champ, okay? The rest of you bums, your work. So today, I think what I would like to do is I'm gonna go through the lesson for today, and we're gonna talk about plot, structure, and acceleration as craft tools that we can use to, just write really great stories and elevate our craft. And I have the third step in our story, which usually I would give to you as homework. But I think what I'll do today is that we'll do the lecture, then Sherry's piece. We'll talk about that. And then with the remaining time we have, we're gonna kind of split it into 2. I like to do like a free writing prompt for like anyone who didn't do last week's. Then we'll come back and share a little bit. And if we have more time, then I'll give you like a head start on the third week's writing prompt. So how does that sound?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right, so we are going to get started. Jennifer just came into the room. So while she's settling in, I'm gonna start sharing my desktop. So let me get this set up. Let's see if Zoom likes sharing today. Hi, Jennifer, good morning.
Good morning.
So I was just telling everybody that today is gonna be a super fun day. We're gonna do the lesson plan, and then, we'll of course talk about the lesson, answer any questions any of you might have. Then we're gonna do Sherry's story, but since Sherry was the only one who sent a story in for a workshop discussion, we're gonna use a lot of the time today for free writing, and then we'll just share with each other. And I think it's harder sometimes to give feedback. At least for me, it's harder just to hear it. It's better to see it as I'm listening to it, but we'll just do our best today with what we've got. So for today's class, I'm going to be talking to you about plot, structure, and we're also going to be, since we have extra time, we'll also be talking about acceleration, which I think is one of the things I honestly wish when I was in my MFA program, someone would have talked to me about how to like make a story move. Like I think we spent a lot of time talking about language and the sentence structure and time, and all of those are of course interconnected to plot. But I think there are really some important mechanisms we have to master as writers if we want people to like actually care about our stories and care about what's happening in them. So we'll be talking about that. So can you all see it, the presentation? Okay, so just give me a minute because okay, so I'm just moving things around a little bit so I can see the slide. So plot, I think for me, like I have some slides here and you guys can kind of jot down what you want to jot down. You can just kind of absorb these thoughts into your writer sensibility. I think a lot of times if you let things kind of stew, they work their way into your writing in like subtle ways, and then as you revise you do it more intentionally. So some of these concepts I just really want you to just listen to, and I love feedback also. So I have like places in the presentation for us to pause and talk through. So, the first thing I'll say, just to kind of center us, is that the last time we talked about craft, we spent a lot of time talking about narrative voice, point of view, and we're talking about how we use those mechanisms, right, in order to ground readers in perspective. And so the concept too is that it's really through the sensory details that we're injecting this feeling of being in a real world. And so those are really critical elements. And I always start with like point of view, perspective, sensory details, because I think a lot of times as we're starting out, it can be really difficult to like keep that front of mind. Intention is really important as writers. Like everything should be intentional and should make sense as it comes to your story. So for plot, the way I like to think about plot is actually what happens in the story is plot. And there's a lot of fancy definitions. I mean, this slide, I found some really good websites, and I have them all here. And I can send, my intention is to send you all the links at the end of the last class, so that you can visit some of these websites and read. Like, you should really become interested in craft books. I've read a ton of craft books, so I invite you to become invested in learning about this and finding your own definition. But for me, like plot is a sequence of events that leads to the character's transformation. And sometimes, we confuse plot, narrative structure. I think people just kind of get confused about all of this. And I honestly think it's less important to have like this kind of crisp definition of what it is in your mind articulated. I think it's more important for you to actually understand what's supposed to happen in a story. So for today, I really want to spend some time talking about, why these kind of events linked together matter, and why there should be some thought put into the shape that those events take place in. So we're going to talk about plot and narrative structure. So, to begin with, I think, if we, like I said, I think if we think about the plot as a series of interrelated events, and I often say that plot is the way that you want people to describe your story or your book. So, if in your mind, you're having a hard time kind of grasping like what exactly is the plot of my work. Half the time I go into it, I don't even know what a plot is. I'm just discovering it as I go. At least that's how I write. You want to ask yourself at some point in your process, like, what the hell am I talking about? Like, can you put it in one sentence? Can you put it in two sentences? And as cliche as it is, like the concept of an elevator pitch where you can like really sum up what you're doing in one or two sentences is really helpful in like figuring out what your narrative structure is. And what the plot of your book is. The narrative structure then is kind of the design or the layout of how that story happens or how things are arranged. So if we're talking about let me just stop sharing for a minute. In this class, have you all read Macy Cart's The True Death of Abel Paisley? Did I give that to you and you all read it? Okay. So for that short story, we can say like, what is the story about? And like, we know it's a first chapter of a novel, so we know like the expectations as readers is different. But if I was gonna like just boil that down to like a sentence, I would say, that story is about a man and his descendants and the people that are related to him. It's about a family that is affected by a big secret. And the story is about the day when the secret is going to be revealed. So that's like the plot of that. Now, when I think about narrative structure, when I think about the design or the layout of the story, I would say, the story takes place in chronological order. So even though there's a little bit of a flashback here and there, it's pretty much happening in real time, the real action. It's told in a second person roving narrative that goes in and out of various characters' perspectives. And the narrative structure, like the idea that this is gonna jump around, right? Like there's a roving narrative structure, tells us, like really prepares us for the novel, because it's a novel where a lot of different things happen, a lot of different perspectives happen, where impossible things happen, like a ghost speaking to us from the afterlife. And so, it's really a terrific kind of story to think about narrative structure. It's also a really good story to think about escalation, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about escalation in the next slide, but I want you to keep these kind of three concepts in your mind as we're talking about plot structures, because I think it's really helpful to like kind of bring it all together. So escalation would be, a sense that the stakes are rising as the action rises in the story, that the tension is building because there's the story itself is kind of pushing back against what the characters want. And so for like our last class next week, we'll be really looking at building characters and having memorable characters. There's a lot of tips and tricks I can teach you. But, within the concept of this, you just have to know that, and we're going to start with Freytag's pyramid, which is, Gustav Freytag is credited with coming up with this kind of pyramid structure, 3-act structure. And, when he wrote, there's a book he wrote in which he was trying to break down like Greek tragedies. And he was trying to break down how those function. And from there, it just kind of like became this standing, like the way that we define plot. It's like, it's credited to him. And interestingly enough, there's been like a lot of talking about pushback. There's a lot of pushback to Freytag's pyramid because a lot of people think is, just very patriarchal, and it's kind of mimicking like this concept of like male orgasms, and like, like this concept that this entire thing is just very, very much furthering the patriarchy. And so we'll kind of like start from this, because I think any writer needs to know Freytag, needs to have seen this. It's just kind of like, some of the things we talk about when you're part of the Western canon of literature. I think it's important for you to understand what are the traditions that we're working within, and you can break them whenever you want, but you need to know what they are. So, the Freytag's, and I might be mispronouncing the man's name, who knows, but Freytag's pyramid says, that there's like kind of like the beginning of the story is part 1, part 2, and part 3. Part 1 is where like there's exposition, we meet the characters, we understand the situation, there's an inciting incident, which means, I think we talked about that 2 weeks ago, like what is different about this day, and so we start from this point where we get familiar with what the world is like, and we also understand what's really different about this day, what's different about the situation. Then as the narrative and like the drama builds, tension is building. So you have this concept of the rising action, which peaks at a climax, a burst of the tension. And then the falling action is where we see the narrative and the dramatic tension ease up. So then when we get to the end, the resolution, the denouement, is just the ending where everything gets resolved. And we talked last week or 2 weeks ago about the fact that sometimes when you get to the ending, it doesn't necessarily mean that the character is transformed. The expectation from readers is that the character will be transformed, and your readers will be less satisfied if your characters don't transform. There are plenty of narratives, books, stories where like what changes is the reader's understanding of the world, the reader's understanding. So the character might kind of finish in a very similar mindset from where they started, but like the reader is transformed. So you got to just figure out what you want to do with your story. Like, it's your main goal to have a character transform, a community transform, or do you want like the change to happen more internally for the reader? For me, the best stories are the stories where both things happen, where the character changes, I am changed in a way that I can recognize within myself. And those are the most affecting fictional stories that I've encountered. I'm gonna go one more slide and then we're gonna take a break and talk. This might be too big, but can you guys see it? Can you see it? Okay. So there are alternatives to, Freytag's story pyramid. And some of them are have to do with kind of like what I like to call traditions, story traditions. And so, there's the hero or heroine's journey, which really is more like a series of trials that lead to rebirth, that lead to a stronger and very obviously transformed person. Within the heroine's journey, there's this idea that we only really are working with like 3 or 4 main stories that humans tell, and it's like man, because we're in a patriarchy, human against human, human against nature. So stories where like it's the environment or the setting, and then human against God, so there's this concept that like within the heroine's journey, you're kind of working within traditions too. There's a structure that is called in medias res, and that is one where you kind of start in the middle of the action. And this one requires a lot of skill, because what you're doing is that you're kind of starting at the climax. And you see that a lot in thrillers, or you see it in books that are more action kind of oriented, where like you start out with like this burst, and then it's like you kind of learn like both how you got there, and then you have like alternating timelines. So you start with like the burst, and then there's like a storyline that's telling you how it all happened, and there's another storyline that's pushing you forward toward resolution, which is again kind of resolving from that middle point. The 7-point structure, which I personally love books that do this. The Bluest Eye does it. I've read so many books that do this masterfully, but the 7-point structure is one where you start at the end of the story, and then you kind of work yourself back. And that one, a lot of times think of it as being like a more kind of female shape of a story, where like it's like a circle, and you kind of like go through a series of points within the structure that get you to the end. And like I said, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye is a perfect example, where you start the bluest eye, understanding that Piccola was raped by her father, had a child by her father, that the entire community was transformed by this. And then the story becomes not about what happened to Piccola, but like how it happened, why it happened. It becomes really a contemplation on the whole world of these characters, and and makes it so that it's more about the story and storytelling. So those are just some structures. There's a ton more. You Google like alternatives to Freytag. You can Google different plot narrative structures, and you're gonna have like a ton of stuff that's gonna come up. So let me stop for a little bit, because I know sometimes talking about structures like snooze fest, it's like maybe not the most interesting thing, but I think talking about structure and talking about narrative structure before we get into acceleration, it's kind of like an important thing for you to consider. And I find that a lot of writers also don't always make intentional choices when it comes to that. So I'm just gonna go around and ask you a little bit about whether or not you have questions about what we've just discussed, or just your general thoughts about structure when it comes to your own work. So maybe we start with Charisse.
Well, for my stories, I've generally, I guess, used Freytags more. And then I got a comment once that I should start in medias res. And as you said, this requires skill. So I was trying, but I'm not sure exactly how when I'm doing it right already, or if what I should read to get more references for this one, because that one in particular is interesting for me to do. And also the 7-point structure, I would be very interested to try this one also. But so far it's been traditional for me.
Okay. Who wants to go next? Katrina?
Yeah, I usually tend to go traditional. I write more short stories than novel length things. So when I approach the stories, I tend to I try to start at the action, like closest to the action as possible, because it has to be so compact, and it's like, how do I build that tension to begin with? So I tend to that's what I try to do. I have heard about the starting at the end and sort of going backward from there, like a reverse timeline. I've never tried it, but that's one that I do really want to try. I just don't know how. But what's really interesting right now, you had mentioned that you usually write and don't think about plot, and it just develops as you're writing. And that's usually how I write. But now, I'm trying to be more plot forward and try to map things out before writing, which is a totally different method from how I usually operate. And I'm struggling with, oh, these are the things that I sort of want to happen. But then as I'm writing, they always want to deviate.
Stories
So
of life. Everyone who's a writer knows, even when you're writing nonfiction,
yeah.
thing pushes against you. It's like, oh, you think you're gonna do that?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just like, oh, maybe it's not even worth trying to map out what might happen or the big plot points. But yeah, that's generally where I'm at with writing with plot.
Yeah, I think it's totally worth it though. The people that I know that are good at outlining, I'm actually gonna try for my next book to outline the whole damn thing, because I actually think even if it changes and it kind of goes wild on me, I still think generally outlines will help you. And I think it helps with accountability a lot, because I think sometimes we get frustrated when we're finding our way through a story or give up, so
yeah, it also makes me excited because I get invested in the story, oh, what's gonna happen from A to B for B to happen from A. And so I get it does give me motivation to write too.
yeah, I love it. Angela, good morning. Hi.
It's 7:30. I'm not an early riser. Anyway, but I'm here. I'm here. I mean, I was really stoked by the what did you call it? The 7-point
structure. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think that would really work for my memoir. That's my sole purpose of being here. I'm not a fiction writer, but I'm interested in it, and I believe I can do it. So these different approaches on how to enter into your story are very useful for me. And I'd like to know more about that, where you start how did you say the beginning, the end with the beginning?
Yeah.
If something happens, and I've been kicking around that idea because I'm writing about a traumatic experience. And so I'm pretty convinced that that is the way I need to go into the story. From the beginning of what happened, the end, and then, just kind of go backwards. But I don't know that I have the skill, but I don't know until I try it.
You gotta try it. And I love the 7-point structure for memoirs and creative nonfiction, narrative fiction. You know, there are two examples that I'm thinking for you that you should read. I really love Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, which is interestingly like he's not like a writer, you know, he's like a comedian. And actually, I heard once, I don't know if it was Toni Morrison or another very lauded writer who once said, if you want to learn how to write stories, you should listen to comedians, because the timing and the pace is so perfect to get people to laugh. And also when you look at bad comedians, you can tell why the joke falls apart. So they're like really good tools. Yeah, I love Heavy. Thank you, Sherry. That's one of my favorites.
I read that one.
Yeah, that one's great. And then the other one I was gonna tell you, I just very recently read Nadia Owusu's Aftershocks, which also employs like giving you a lot at the front. Hers is in essay, so it's a little bit of a deviation, but you kind of get up front like what we're gonna be doing here in this book, and then you're kind of working your way through it for the whole book. I'll think of that. And the website that I'm gonna give you, that is the website that I use for this presentation. I mean, it's fantastic. It has like everything laid out with the steps and the graphs are a little bit colorful, so it doesn't really work for my presentation because I like my own aesthetic. But this guy, or woman, I don't know who the author is of this website, they really like give you point by point on their like phrase tag structure, all of them. I'm reading Crying in HMAR right now. That was a great example of starting with the ending, because right at the beginning you find out her mom died, like that's it, and then you're working your way through it. I think it's a brilliant way of, because the fact is that for narrative nonfiction and like memoir, I mean, where's the tension coming from? You're alive and you're writing it, so it's like, you know what I mean, like a lot of times what we think of as tension is a character gonna make it, like, things like that. So yeah, Angela, I think it's really smart for you to like really look at that structure. And I think it's really smart for you to invest your time in reading people who have done it really well. So all of these examples that we're giving you, I think they're excellent. Well, Sherry's got really good taste in books. So I'm just gonna the chat is gonna be downloaded. I can also share the chat with you guys because I realized last week that the chat also was available. So I can also send that to all of you. So Grace chose A Taste of War. I'm gonna put it on my to be read list because is that a novel or a?
It's a memoir. I still think about it because Grace Cho, she's a professor in the College of Staten Island in sociology. And then I just read the book this summer. It's a memoir about her mom being a Korean war bride. And then she found, Grace found out when she was 23 that her mom was a prostitute in the Korean War. And that's how her father took her to the United States. And then her mom suffered from schizophrenia. So she also talks about schizophrenia and how traumatic all of that was, So I highly recommend it. I still think about that book,
I think maybe start with that one, Angela.
What's it called again?
A Taste of War.
Taste of War.
Thank you.
It's one of the books I found that deals with schizophrenia in a way that was very interesting, and it was schizophrenia and history,
Which is probably the structure of it is brilliant. There's a lot you can do with those kind of themes. So Sherry, why don't you tell us? I'm sorry, Angela, were you gonna say anything else about plot?
Going back to that, I have vacillated, and that's why I've been, taking classes this is my first real fiction workshop. So my challenge was, okay, do I leave that very traumatic event to build up to it with the tension and all the things that are happening, so that when this thing happens, the reader is totally shocked by what happens. So I've been going back and forth with that. So so I'm not sure, if I should do it that way or if I should. So I've just been kind of like stuck.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the worst thing that you can do is be paralyzed by the decision. So what I would say is like pick a thing and go through one draft. You just got to pick it. You got to make a decision and you got to just work through it. And then, you know, depending on like, do you have better readers? Do you have people who are willing to read the book for you? Like you can pay someone to read your whole book for you. But you can then see like, it doesn't have the maximum impact, emotional impact, you know, all of that. We're going to talk about acceleration next, once we get through like our class discussion. And that can be another way in which you can kind of inject tension and movement into your narratives. But I think it's just, you just got to try it. And then if there's another better way to do it, all that writing doesn't go to waste. Because at that point, you're really kind of talking about moving the pieces around.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, like if you're thinking about, you know, just like there's been some books that I think are like really interesting and wild and their structure. And then I go to listen to the writer because I love listening to writers talk about writing. And, you know, I don't even remember what the name of the book is, but there's a book I read where like, it was really like a very jumbled timeline, but it was done brilliantly. And I just went to meet this person because I was in awe. And when, I don't know if I asked or somebody else in the audience asked them, like, how did you do this? It's like incredible. And she was like, oh, I wrote it in like chronological order and then I jumbled it. And I was like, damn you, you know, because I was thinking like this person's like the most brilliant writer who ever lived, that she could write in this kind of way. Just like, no, I wrote it sequentially and then I like moved it all around and it was brilliant. So to me, it's like, you know, I think there's something to be said for just writing things the way it happened sometimes, because, and that's why I think starting with the end and working yourself the whole way through to the beginning can be a really good way to like give yourself that kind of, I think there's urgency in that structure too, as you're writing it, because you want to get back to the end, to the beginning, you know? It's like, as a writer and as a reader, you're kind of like racing against the narrative. So let's keep going. Sherry, what are your feelings about structure, narrative, plot? Like, what are your thoughts?
So I've always thought plot and structure were my weakest writing muscles. Because of what I did during undergrad in college, I did like a lot of French, I mean like post-colonialism and like all that, you know, you mess with structure, post-structuralism. So that destroyed me. But then so when I was writing, everything was sort of like experimental, you know, and all of that. And then nothing really goes past, you know, I don't really have anything published. So the last year and a half, I tried working on a novel. I finished it, and then in the beginning, it was just I tried to be again just as experimental and like not player, you know, like I was messing around with plot a lot, and then I had to kind of rein it down because then I got stuck. And yeah, I don't know if it has plot necessarily, but I've been very interested in, I guess this is kind of like acceleration too, this idea of propulsion, you know, and how even if it's maybe not a traditional plot point, that people will keep like turning the page. And so that's something that I'm trying to crack, you know.
Yeah, well, you came to the right place. So yeah, they're just devices we use. And I think a lot of times as writers, especially if you've been indoctrinated in a master's program or in workshops, where like we have a tendency in our profession to be very you know, like we can be very precious about language, and we can be very precious about character, and we can look down at plot and, you know, as being something that's not art. But to me, like it's amazing to me, because, you know, like the Greek tragedies, Shakespeare, I mean, like all of these tomes, right, that like are what the Western canon is built on, started out as like plays and entertainment, you know, they started out as like weeklies in magazines where like the whole point was to keep people reading, you know, and like picking up the next thing. So this idea that plot is a bad thing to me is it's just another way in which we can see like white supremacy injecting itself.
I was just about to say, because a lot of I just, in the past few years, I've just been thinking that some of the people I've taken classes from, so a lot of the times who they were putting on top that we were all looking at, it's like David Foster Wallace, you know, and I don't know, it's a very specific type of reading, and you know, like Pynchon or something like that. So it's not, yeah, they're not concerned with plot more or legibility. It's more like, well, I will show you how smart I am, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me tell you something. I mean, there are still some people like, you know, I find Wallace to be like unreadable, you know, but I force myself to read him, you know, because I'm like, I mean, I'm gonna be a well-read cat, even if it means that I'm like kicking and screaming the whole way, you know, like I think we have to know what tradition we're working within. And yeah, Pynchon, I mean, my goodness, it's like, you know, but I gotta tell you, like when the world is mostly concerned with like a coming of age from a white man's perspective, like there was a time where that was the whole canon. The whole canon was white men fighting whales and white men fighting the devil and white men, you know. And so like part of what we have to consider is that there's great opportunity. That's the way I see it. Like I see it as like fertile ground. Like my novel is like, you know, that's what I was trying to do. And that's why I struggled for a long time, because I didn't have examples. Like I honestly, and it's not like, ooh, look at me, so original. Like the book I was trying to write, I have never read it. So I didn't even know like how to write it. Like, how do I write it? And so that's part of the reason why, you know, I think it's important for us to like also know that as a source of strength, you know, like our ability to write something and create something that like there's no map for it, you know, there's no blueprint for it. I think that's also kind of terrific, but you have to know how to do it, right? Because also like my characters, you have to care about them. You know, there's one character that's going totally crazy, destroying her neighborhood. And like, I had to get you to love her. Like you have to love her in order to like stay invested in what happens. And so, you know, like all of these elements of like fiction that we've learned from these masterful writers about character development and about interiority, they are things that we need to understand and master as well, even as we're attempting to break new ground. It's really critical. Al, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. Narrative structure, what are your thoughts?
I think, yeah, like short stories and novels, longer form is still so new to me. And so, yeah, I struggle with writing longer form. Like, you know, poetry can basically do whatever it wants. And I can, you know what I mean? I can manipulate it in any way. I can make it really short and succinct. It can be like 5 lines. I can make it pages long. And so plot is something that I'm like, oh God, so like create characters that, like you said, that people care about. I have to, yeah, like create a structure that like makes sense, even if it's not sequential. And so those things are also alluring to me. Like when I read, I'm captivated by plot and characters that are magical and like make me think, and that I can align myself with. But yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out for myself. And as I've started writing, I've felt something similar to what Katrina said. Yes. Which is that like plot kind of gets away from me when I'm starting to write. Like I'm like, I think something is going to happen, and then, you know, a few pages in, something else entirely is going on, and I don't know if that's like you said, the story just kind of pushing back against me, or and just me needing to be like, no, this is what I want to say, or if I should just go with it, you know what I mean? Because even in poetry, you can just like ride the waves of what you're thinking and feeling, and like that makes sense. But I don't know if that necessarily works for longer form writing, unless you're, unless you're like a David Foster Wallace, or you're like one of these other authors who are like writing, there's nothing. It's just like, this is what I'm thinking in this moment, but I'm putting it down on paper. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I appreciate it, but I'm still struggling with it myself.
Yeah.
Stream of consciousness. Thank you. That's what I was looking for.
I think, I think it's great because Sherry's piece that we're gonna be reading has quite a lot of stream of consciousness, and it's done really well. So I think it's, I think you gotta like rein it in because everything is intentional and every word matters, so the thing, like I said, I mean, I'm a big believer in just like the first draft is you telling yourself the story. And so like you want to put no censorship on yourself, It's like you're discovering what your wonderful brain and your ancestors are pouring out of you through the spirit world, God, whatever you believe, like that's your first draft, And then your human brain and your consciousness and your intention and like the craft that you're learning comes back to like elevate it, not to like kill the wildness that lives in it, but like to make it better. And so, I think to me, like there are other alternatives to this concept of plot. And I think those alternatives can be really beautiful. Ocean Vuong's novel, which is really like a meditation from a son to their mother. I think it's beautiful, and like nothing really happens in that book. Like there's not anything that you can, I mean, there's some like experiences that are worthwhile and valuable, but I can't think of a moment in that novel where I'm like, that's the climax. That's where this character, the moment that will change this character's life forever. Like I don't think it works that way. And the value in work like that is that, depending on where you are in your career as a writer too, like I think a lot of writers will get to a point where like maybe you do write a book that's really just concerned with storytelling. I just finished reading one of my favorite writers of all time, The President and the Frog by Carolina Di Robertis. And this book is like a tiny book. And like Carolina, it's masterful. Like Cantoras, her last novel before this one, I was like in love with this woman. I was like, how do I want to be her friend. I just started stalking her on social media. Like it was one of those books that I was like, oh my goodness. And then The President and the Frog is such a different book. It's like about this guy who like gets captured and is in a hole in the ground and starts talking to a frog. And it's like an incredible meditation on storytelling, and like it's transformative in a way, but it's a lot quieter of a book, and I loved it. So I'm only saying this because I think sometimes we think there's only one way to be prescribed, and that even this concept of like, I like propulsion, I like acceleration, but I also can appreciate books that don't do that, where the language is so beautiful that like, I don't care that there's no plot. I don't care that the characters aren't quirky or complicated. Like I'm just like, oh my God, this is just beautiful. And it's just like the pleasure of reading beautiful words, and pain and all that other stuff. So there's something to be said, Al, for just, finding your way, not putting a lot of pressure on yourself. And sometimes like the work wants to be what it wants to be. So we got to like make room for that too. Jennifer, you want to go?
Yeah. Absorbing everything. So yeah, I mean, I also come from poetry. I've never written anything like long or form or anything like that to be published other than like academic papers. And the way that I kind of enter, I guess like I've always had like the hero's journey in my head because I've been consuming Greek mythology since I was like 8. Like I love it. I'm obsessed with it. I almost majored in classics. So that's always in the back of my head, and also because I like sci-fi and stuff like that, and that's normally the plot that they use. But when I sit down to write, and because of the kind of source material, which is some personal stories and some family stories and stuff like that, it's been really a very windy and like unclear road to what the plot of this is. So I'll get scenes or characters, scenes between characters and things that maybe seem like they're not really connected. And I've been marinating on this for like a year now. So I think like I've done outlines several times that have been deleted and rewritten and whatever. I think they're helpful in that way if you let them change with the story as well. And I think the other night after the exercise that we did last week, which I didn't hand in, but I wrote it, and it opened up a whole new I was like, holy cow, this is the part of the story that I was missing, because now a bunch of things that were in my previous outlines make sense. And I'm like, I didn't, like I feel like I wouldn't have found my way to that without the prompt. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So yeah, I don't know. I just kind of flow with it. I kind of write down the things that come to me. I like that you said the first draft, you're kind of just letting the spirit world use you as a portal, and then when you see what's on paper, you have a puzzle to put together. So that's where I am right now.
One thing that I want to invite all of you to consider, especially when it comes to, just how busy we are. Sometimes we're uninspired. I mean, like all of the prompts I'm giving you are based on Macy Card's book, right? Like this idea of surprise, this idea of changing perspectives as a way to build tension very naturally and organically. I think, today we're gonna just turn in a minute to talk about acceleration. And, to me, like, I think it's really important for us not to let ourselves off the hook, like, I think the world is very invested in our erasure and the erasure of our stories. And I think that when we let ourselves be like I was exhausted this week, but I revised the story. It's such shittiest revision I've probably done my whole life. And I probably did more harm than good, but it's gotten me closer, right? Because I discovered some things through this revision. And when I revise, I really think about these things. Like, what if I started from a different point in the story? And just kind of changing the lens. Like, can I make it a wider lens for the story, or like a narrower lens? Do I want the narrative structure to be like a funnel, where like you start with this really big thing and then we narrow? Or do I want to flip it, where you start with like this really narrow thing and then it gets bigger? So like, for me, I think because I'm like very interested in like architecture. I really love visual art. Like for me, like I think about the shape of the story, and that's the way I think about narrative structure. Like I think about it as, okay, I have a character and I have a situation, and sometimes the story is more like, I want to end on a feeling. I don't want to end on, some big dramatic thing. I want to end on a sound, or I want to, and it has to make sense. Like I want to get to a point where like, a rainbow on a sheet, it's like a transformative thing to the character and the reader. So it's like a series of things for me. So, I just invite you to really like allow yourself to think about what you're doing intentionally, and to use devices like plot structure to transcend whatever it is, like I think that's how stories can transcend themselves. Is when we really kind of intentionally push them. One story that I really like to teach, we won't teach it here, but it's Tony Early has a story called A Place of Safety. And it's a story that I don't know if it was this summer or 2 summers ago, was in Harper's. And it's a story about a tornado. And it's a story about like 2 little girls end up trapped in a house, and their mom left them in their house because she went to run an errand real quick. They were asleep. And like thinking about it, I just got goosebumps because the story is like so good, but it's like a wild story. Like it has like all these perspective changes. It's like a tornado, you know? And so when I think about being daring and like doing something where like the shape of the work mirrors the content, Don Lee, I teach his short story, which actually we might read that for like the last class. But you know, he has a short story that I've taught quite a bit, called The Partition, which is brilliant. It's brilliant. And it's really like concerned with this idea of transcendence. And I think it does it really well. Or like at the end, whatever the story is that we think the story is, the plot is transcended through plot, you know, so it's really brilliant. But anyway, so let's talk a little bit about structure, about acceleration. That's the last slide. So when I think about the art of escalation, you know, I think a lot about what is it in fiction that makes it so that we are unable to stop reading. There are things I've read, honestly, very recently. I used to be one of those people who like never gave up on a book, even if it was terrible. Like I would be like, oh, I'm gonna finish this sucker, you know? And the fact is that now that I have kids and I'm working and I'm writing and I'm trying to like actually make a life as a writer, like I don't got time for that. So bad books, bye-bye, you know? But I'm always very interested. And as a writer, you know, you're gonna start reading everything. If you haven't, as a poet, or like now you're gonna start reading and seeing it. Your brain is gonna break it apart. And that's what I want you to develop, this muscle. Because for me, when I put a book down and I could care less, I know exactly why it is. I know it's because the characters weren't developed enough. I know it's because there is no escalation. I know that it's because it's a hollow story, you know? It makes no sense. You know, there's a lot of books out in the world, as hard as it is for us to get published, you know? There's a lot of books out in the world that are garbage, you know? And that's a harsh thing to say, but it's true. So to me, it's like the reason the book is published is because someone loved it. And I can also appreciate that. Like I can also appreciate, oh, you know why this book was chosen is because it's taken this really fresh look at family. It's like wrestling mother-daughter relationships, is wrestling class. Like, you know, there's a lot of really valuable reasons why books and stories and certain writers do really well, even though they might not be my cup of tea. So for me though, I'm really a student of escalation and propulsion. You know, if I think about like the sweet spot, like what I want to do and focus on my legacy to be, I want it to be like this thing that I think happens in my culture, really naturally, which is like, if you don't know how to tell a story, nobody's listening to you. Like people just turn to the next person, people interrupt you and take the story from you. And so part of what I want to do with my work is tell stories that, like, you know, you can't put down. So, you know, in terms of the points of escalation, this is what I want to start, and then we're going to have a conversation about this, because I think there's a lot of different ways we can think of it. But to me, like the first thing to consider is just like, where are we starting from? You know, like from what place is your story starting? So with the secret, the surprise, the ghost hunting, that in itself, the secret, the surprise is often connected to like an obsession we have as human beings. You know, it might have something to do with loyalty, you know, it might have something to do with abandonment, you know, it might have something to do with displacement. It might have something to do with a lot of different things. But the first thing that I think as writers, I want you to always be excavating what is your obsession, and I want you to give into it. Because once you discover what your obsession is, I think you'll find that most of your stories are doing that. And you can think about your body of work as an escalation, okay? Where like you're writing these things that kind of connect over time. And maybe you're telling the same story over and over again with different characters and different situations, and that's okay. Within like the piece that you're writing though, the individual piece, I want you to think about like, what is that seed that is the beginning point for your character? And then you have to like decide how you're gonna move it. Are you gonna move it physically? Like our ghosts are gonna like haunt people, and they could be doing something that feels like physically threatening, choking them as they eat. You know, the way in which to think about like the malice or like the point, the seed, and you can escalate. If we just do that as an example, like each time the situation magnifies, right? So like the first time the person just kind of like, it's like a scratchy throat, like it's scary, but like they recover. And maybe the second time they're not even eating, and it's just like the throat closes up, you know? And we can see how if it's a physical thing, by the third time, like the person's dead, you know, like they're choked. You know, if we're doing something that feels more emotional, I'm thinking about, you know, what we heard last week, which was a woman who has had an abortion, is about to give birth, and now is being haunted by that baby that was, you know, like the fetus that died. Or we could say is being haunted by her own sense of guilt or shame. And that to me feels like an emotional or a spiritual seed. And so emotional turmoil could be the acceleration, where this person is unable to sleep and all of a sudden unable to function, all of a sudden unable to tell the difference between reality and fantasy. And these are the points of escalation. So this concept of like magnification, deterioration, it's like being heightened in really clear ways where I can see it. The first time the seed happens, it's just a sound. The second time it happens, it's like a sensation of like the ghost being in your body or close to you, or it's like a cold spot in your house, or like whatever it is. But there's a way in which you can take that concept, that seed, and magnify it, heighten it, so that each time you touch it, the reader understands there's movement in the story, because it's like there's some kind of movement happening from the last time we encountered it to this time. One thing that I like to do, which I think is really, really easy, and it's, you can see a lot of examples of this if you look at movies, because movies rely on this kind of device, and it's a trick that I like to ask myself, and it's always like, what's the worst thing that can happen to the character at this moment? And like the worst thing that can happen to the character, I make it happen. I mean, it's terrible, you know, but I'm like, a good time. Because I'm like, you know what's the worst thing that can happen to this character in this moment? Is that a family member comes to stay with them. And the family member tells them there's no baby crying. What's wrong with you? There's no sound here. You know, and like, it's a way in which like, all of a sudden, like the character starts feeling crazy. Right? So what's the worst thing that can happen is that a person's really concerned about money and they lose their job, and then their identity gets stolen from them. And then, you know, the person who's supposed to be like the one that they always hit up for loans leaves town, or they lose their jobs. So there's like a way in which you can ask yourself, and it's a way in which you can, it's like an onion. You can keep doing it like forever. And I think, you know, one of the plot books I really like, it's like Bird by Bird by Lamott, which is what, you know, this kind of like classic book. Edwidge Danticat actually recommends that book. That's how I read it. But that book, in it, she says that like for escalation, you know, the plot, like that's what we're doing. It's like pushing that concept that the worst thing is gonna happen, and you're gonna like push it in like a delicious way. It like feels delicious to the reader, because it's like very satisfying to see something, see the character in like jams that you're like, how are they gonna get out of this, you know? Until you reach either a point of complete transformation, they're forced to transform, or until, you know, they are forced to choose not to be transformed. And then you have an opportunity to change the reader. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here. Any questions about propulsion, escalation?
I guess I'm familiar with this idea of like because I do watch a lot of like films, and I like to read essays about how they're broken down. And this, like, yeah, like I see this in a lot of movies. I feel really bad doing that to my characters. I'm like, every time that I'm like, what's the worst thing that could happen here? I'm like, oh no, like I don't know how I'm gonna get you out of this as like a whole person. So, you know, so that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's tough. It is tough. I mean, you know, and I think about that too sometimes, like, when I'm like, oh, why does the character have to suffer? Or why can't we be writing characters that are happy? And like, it's just not as compelling. It's just not as compelling. Like reading a story where like a character is happy and they're going through because the escalation can be good, right? The escalation could be someone who wins the lotto and all of a sudden every single dream they ever had comes true. I'm not interested in reading that. I'm like, you know, I don't come to fiction to feel good. Like, you know, I got my kids, I got love, I got delicious food, I got wine, I got cafe. Like, you know, I don't come to fiction for that. I come to fiction for like other things. So, you know, I think it's like you got to kind of give in to like feeling badly. And also no, there's redemption, right? Like for me, like what I am most invested in my characters is giving them a path to personal liberation. And the path to personal liberation means that they're going to confront things that in the real world people would confront in order to like get to personal liberation. That's the way it is in life, folks. Like most of us are not going to become free unless we figure out what's keeping us from being free and defeating that, overcoming it, being, you know, destroyed by it, and then finding a path through anyway, you know? So, but it's hard. Any other thoughts, questions? All right, so seems like everybody's set with plot, narrative structure, points of escalation. Everybody knows what they got to do. All right, so what we're gonna do right now is that we are going to read Sherry's piece, which she sent in, and we're going to give her the option to do either like the Lamar's praxis, which, you know, which guides us in how to talk about stories with the artist as really being the point person and asking questions. Or we can go like the more traditional path, which means just the writer is mostly quiet until the end. So I'm gonna bring up the short story, and then Sherry, if we have enough time, so actually you can read the whole thing to us if you want, or you can just read the last part because it's not that long.
Okay, I can do both since I'm the only one today.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and maybe like to have a mix of the two, the hybrid.
Okay, that sounds good. All
Okay. The last thing you remember in your mouth is the chemical sweet taste of glucerna because the diabetes prevented the doctors from giving you Ensure. Not that it matters, it was still a chemical milkshake that you used to give to your patients at the nursing home where you used to work, where you felt so sorry for folks like Mr. Steinberg, who lived through the Holocaust, and Mrs. Santiago, whose son got deported back to Ecuador. And you couldn't bear that all they had as dining options was Ensure or Glucerna, and you snuck milk cookies and Marie biscuits that you bought from the Russian store where you bought them in bulk. You hated the smell of Ensure then. But you hated it even more now when you couldn't even swallow any thickened liquid because everyone was afraid that you would choke. This was before the peg tube was inserted through your stomach, when you could taste nothing except your old saliva and the mucus from your lungs as it got suctioned from you every few hours. This was before you died, obviously. All the bright lights in the hospital made it hard to sleep, but it didn't matter because you slept through it all. Your brain was already giving your body signals to sleep and to forget and to stay unconscious. Even the patient screaming next to you was already part of the dream nightmare you were experiencing. When you tried to speak, you couldn't get the words out anyway. There was no water to loosen your tongue, and the scratchy noise your mouth tried to make was only an echo of a body in a tin can. When you died, you were alone. The nurse and the nurse technician in the unit you were assigned couldn't be bothered to look into you the whole night as you gasped for breath, the oxygen from the nasal cannula barely registering in your body. You could feel your lungs slowly give out, but you were so damn sleepy that when you felt the sudden burst of pain from your head, when the blood clot in the left side of your brain grew an inch within the hour from the 4 centimeters from the previous night, as your body floated out of you, you remembered your first ex-wife and how she never cut her hair that grew to her waist, and how it was always a shade of clayrol chestnut brown instead of white. She was already 60, but she wanted to think she was still 35 and could still turn heads. You admitted finally to yourself that you were jealous that she still looked young for her age, that even though you also looked young for your age, you were already 80 and you were in denial this whole time that you could live longer than you had to. It wasn't fair. You felt like a 50-year-old with a 50-year-old's libido. You had girls lined up, and you even had a girl that you met on Facebook tell you she loved you and not your money, and promised that she would take care of you in your old age. But that was months ago. You got stuck in New York because your head got smashed into the concrete. It was wind that did it, the force of karma. The way how you went down just made your blood vessels explode. Everyone around you was saying how lucky you were that you were found when you were found. Otherwise, you could have died on the spot. You understood that you're no longer alive because your body looked like a desiccated shell of its once glorious self. You watched in morbid fascination as rigor mortis settled into your body as your insides let go of everything, and you could even smell the shit and piss the diaper that wrapped your groin area. It reminded you of the time when you worked at the nursing home and found Mr. Roberts dead. It was the same shit and piss story, but it was sad with Mr. Roberts because you found him at the start of your morning shift. He was already cold to the touch, and you knew that none of the night shift people gave a damn and only cared when they realized he had passed sometime in the middle of the night and they forgot to let the supervisor know. In a blink of an eye, your first ex-wife, Elena, suddenly appeared, and you knew just as suddenly that this is what it's like to be a ghost, and that everything happens simultaneously because time has expanded and past, present, and future somehow collided in a way that isn't disorienting. And then I did this one yesterday. When you felt your throat itch, you dismissed it because you thought it was just the beginnings of an allergic reaction. You didn't even like the taste of Chinese buns. No, you didn't like the idea of Chinese buns because Chinese buns were dense. You liked them once when you were still married to Franco, when you were still a young girl who knew nothing but pebbles of hunger in your belly. That seemed like a long time ago. Now you couldn't refuse your son. It wasn't his fault his father died and you were the one left alive. You knew he didn't like you as much as his dad. It wasn't your fault that you had to leave him behind, a toddler in the Philippines, so you could work yourself to the bone and to bring him over and to bring Franco over. Your son had it rough when his father decided he would stay with him because you didn't want him to stay in your apartment, and his second ex-wife didn't want him to staying in hers. He was homeless, in fact, and your son felt sorry for him. Never mind that your son was already 35, single, partially employed, and living in the basement of your house. The bow that made your throat itch didn't have roast pork inside, even though your son told you that he bought the buns that had sweet red bean filling so you wouldn't have to eat pork because he knew that you couldn't stand the smell ever since you married a Muslim man who you divorced anyway after 10 years because he wouldn't convert to your Christian church. Your ex-husband, the one who died, loved his pork buns since they reminded him of his childhood in the Binondo Chinatown, where he used to play hooky with his classmates and playing jackstones, marbles, and tumbang preso with old cans they found on the street. Your son bought dozens of buns and gave you one so that you would remember your ex-husband. You felt bad. You didn't want to eat buns even though you liked the taste of the white pillowy dough. It was just too many calories, and the carbohydrates were something you tried your best to avoid. Just because you reached 55 didn't mean that you let yourself go, but you decided for once you would have a bun, as long as it wasn't pork. Anyway, your son bought it from that one Chinese bakery in 86th Street, the one you knew was clean, but you should have known that it wasn't as simple as that. The white dough felt like stone in your throat, and you remembered your ex-husband's face and how much he hated you. Then you remembered how much you hated him. As the white dough passed through your throat, you wanted to say to the world that you are Elena Madrigal Santos and that you would never again take the name of a man again.
Yeah, that was great. So we're gonna talk about this story. We're lucky because we got to read both parts of the exercise together. So we know the ghost, we know the ex-wife. And so why don't we start by sharing our impressions with Sherry? What do we think worked really well? What do we admire? What are some compliments that we want to give?
I think that there's, yeah, I mean, it was lyrical. It was just so, the descriptions were beautiful. They draw you in. And I think like something that I'm always aware of is like when sentences are really, really long. Someone else mentioned this, I think maybe last week. And you just did it so beautifully, just like, I mean, it is stream of consciousness, like just like thinking. And yeah, it just like made me want to keep reading. I wanted to hear what was happening next, even like the small things like, oh, this shop on 86th Street, you know what I mean? Even these like little details, I could see it all. And so, yeah, it was, yeah, beautifully described and written.
Yeah, I like how you were kind of describing the physical pain and kind of going through like the breakdowns of the body, just because I've been thinking about how to do that myself. And I like one thing that you said or in that stream of consciousness was just like being really tired. And um like that just reminded me of something I've heard before, which is that like death is when your desire to rest overcomes like everything else. And so like for me it was like, oh, that made the description click, because it's like, yes, like your body just, you're just really tired, which means you're about to die. So yeah.
I would like to praise especially the first part, the technical aspect describing how the body breaks down and dies, because well, if I were to write something, I would know exactly what happens to the body. So I appreciate all the details there. And apart from the language, also the details in both pieces, because for example, I just came back from the Philippines. So all the buns, I had them when I was there. So it's like, it brings me back, and that's how they taste. And another thing that I wanted to say was, it was particularly heartbreaking, the detail about the son, that the son preferred the father, but in the part of the father, there was no mention of the son at all. So I thought this was brilliant, because who the son loved didn't exactly think of him in the same level. So I thought it was well done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we think about a lot, like how to use silence to say something very pointed in our work. And that's like a very difficult thing to do. because like having, again, like one of the things we want to do is have these pieces be in conversation with each other in ways that are like really subtle. And you're right, Cherise, like the minute I saw that about the son, I went back in my mind to the other previous piece. And I was like, oh snap, like he didn't even think about his son, you know, like, and I thought that was very, very, very telling, you know, like without even mentioning it. That's exactly right. It's like who loves who, who's haunted by who, you know, whose absence matters, right? Because she's the one that had to leave the kid. And so all of a sudden, like we can see a theme emerging in the piece, absence, right? Within the family. What else? What else do we think worked?
I'll echo everyone else. Like I agree with what's been said. Just to add like a few little things, like the I also got that sense of like tiredness and dying. I felt like the stream of consciousness, sometimes I equate that to like a frantic sort of feeling, but here it does feel like tired. It's well matched. And I think the sentences are quite dynamic. They'll be like really long sentences, but then followed up with a short sentence. It just like creates this like pacing in which I don't get tired when I read, because sometimes when I read writing that's a ton of stream of consciousness, I get kind of tired of it, but this one I don't, because it stays dynamic. And yeah, just to talk about what we were working on before with the senses, I felt like those descriptions were really nice. I would have to research a lot to see like what it is, what happens when like an older person dies. And it is, it really takes me there with all the descriptions that you have, like the taste, the feelings. You have enough there to really bring me to the scene.
Right. Okay, so anybody else? Any other comments about from praise?
Yeah, I agree with all the foregoing comments. What struck me also was the use of engaging the senses, because in doing so, it puts the reader on location, and the reader she invites the reader in, and then you're able to go through all the various things that the character is feeling, thinking, tasting, touching, and that keeps you engaged. It keeps me, that's one of the elements of fiction or any type of writing that keep me interested, is what is going on, and can I relate to what I hear, to what I'm seeing through the narrator's eyes, through what I'm tasting, smelling. And I really appreciated how she did the whole thing with the Chinese, I think it's Chinese bao, I think it was called. And you guys have to forgive me because I am a visual learner. And if I see it, I'm going to remember it. But if I hear it, not so much. But there were parts of it that really struck me and kept me interested.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks for all the feedback, everybody. So now let's think about what are some of the things that we think we have questions about or feedback we want to offer. Sherry, do you have any questions that you want us to start from?
Actually, not really, because this is also super new to me. When you gave us the prompts, I was thinking, okay, ghost story. And because I had gone through a lot of deaths in the last 2 years of many different folks, actually. So I've been thinking about death and mortality a lot. So I guess that's why I'm writing about that. And then when you had the the ghost story prompt, I thought about, well, yeah, I think about ghosts a lot in different ways, and and I guess like, where is there redemption for people in the afterlife? That's something I'm actually headed with a lot of my work now, I think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't really have questions. I'm just curious to hear people's responses. And, again, because it's so new, I'm not really in that frame of questioning yet.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Angela.
I had a question, Sherry. And maybe it was because, again, I couldn't see it for that long, but I was a little bit confused with who. I know there was a shifting in the voice, the second part of the story, but I wasn't clear on who it shifted to. Who was that person?
Oh, that was the ex-wife, Elena.
Okay, that's okay. The ex-wife. Now she was looking at the dead man, or she was.
No, they're in
See, I
like
was a
different
little
locations.
confused. You have to forgive me because,
No,
again,
it's fine.
I couldn't see it in front of me. I couldn't go back if I had questions like that. So
Yeah, no, they're in different locations and different times, actually. The way how I was seeing it.
Yeah. So I think it's a challenging thing to do ghosts who are hunting people. Because you get to like make the world what we wanted to make. So just like a couple of really technical things, Sherry. Like I think one thing that I think works really well in section 1 is that, that character is very like aware of the environment and draws a lot in. So even though it's a second point of view, and we get a lot from like his perspective about his life, it feels like it's actually moving. Where like the second piece feels a lot more interior, like a lot more still. And I think that works really well. And like I could tell immediately there were two different people, like I could tell that even though the point of view stayed the same, the you was different. But in the second part, I actually became more aware of the you being used a lot. Like it felt like more clunky. And so what I would invite you to do is to go back and try to get rid of the you. So your son, name the son. Like one of the devices we have to really get good at is whatever point of view you're writing in, whether it's the I or the third person or the second person, is to like not use that so much, because it like grates on us as readers. So like part of what you want to do is to like make the perspective disappear. So eventually everything feels like a third person perspective, unless it's like really important for you to situate me again, that you should like fall behind me, like as a reader, so that, somebody's biting something, the person's just biting it. Look at the teeth, like bring our attention to different things, because that's going to make the piece feel more dynamic.
Yeah, I just to comment on that, like actually before I approached this second exercise, I was panicking because I thought, oh, it was working really well. It felt like it was working really well in the first section, but then if I replicate it, it's like not a different, it's the same voice. So yeah,
you can do it. I mean, I think self-consciousness makes us clunky writers sometimes, and I think it's a first draft, so it should be clunky. But I want to call it out to you because I think it's worth you trying to pull this off. And I think the way to do it, where like both are second person, is to show a great deal of restraint in how many times you use the word you. You've already situated us in a you. So like, you don't have to keep saying it, especially things like your son, your ex-husband, like call people by their names, because that's a way that you can get rid of probably like 15 instances of it within one paragraph. So all of you think about this, and this applies, like I said, to all the POVs. First person POV, I have a bad habit of being like, I, like every sentence starts with I. And part of what I do in revision is that I go back and I get rid of like, I say to myself, like, I don't want to use the word I at all in 2 paragraphs. And it's hard, like to like do it is really tough because you have to make the character like just see the things and not be like, I walked through the door and sat in a couch, you know? The yellow couch was soft that day. The pillow on the yellow couch poked my butt. I don't know what I said. Obviously it's hard to do, but when you're doing it in revision, it gets easier the more you do it, but you have to be intentional about it. What other feedback do we have for Sherry for this piece? What are other ideas or thoughts or questions you had?
I mean, because we were so inside the first character's body, it took me a while to know their gender, and I was wondering that throughout, and I don't know if it's necessary for me to know, but I was just like, what does this person like physically look like? And like, yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's the exact thing I was gonna say was what Jennifer said. Is that what did he look like? What was his mouth like? His nose, his hands, his hair, and other physical attributes that the character have, and maybe somehow that could be sprinkled in or mentioned by the ghost. That's I'm guessing that she was the one that was married to the person. Okay, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's Franco.
Okay, all right. So,
guy
yeah,
who
so,
died.
so maybe she could say, you know, and I hated the way your mouth moved when you did X, Y, and Z, or just some little small detail that would ground us a little bit more in what she's describing in terms of how he looks even. I don't know if that will serve you, but that's just a thought.
Yeah. I think there's also, because they're ghosts, the ghost starts the story. I mean, it's actually kind of like a really easy thing to get out of the way, you know, like to put it really early on, like, because it is distracting. I remember the first time I read it thinking that, like, who is there? You know, and just being like curious about gender. And I don't know that I thought it was a male voice, but then when I found that it was a male voice, I was like, oh, this is a very male voice, you know? So it's probably very simple to do it like in the first few sentences or the first paragraphs.
Okay, I'll just mention his penis, okay?
Or it could be something else, something more subtle.
Can I say something?
In the afterlife.
I kind of felt that at first too, of like, is this person a man? Is this person a woman? But I actually kind of liked that when the moment I realized it was a man is when the character starts talking about, I have like girls on Facebook who were telling me that they love me without my money. And I was like, that's a dude. And at first I was like, I felt the same way of like, oh, is this a man or a woman? Or like, is this, you know, someone who's not, you know what I mean? Like, I wasn't sure like where in the galaxy of gender this person was, but I kind of liked that was the reveal, that was the moment where I was like, some dude who's 80 flirting with some 22-year-old on Facebook. Yeah, he's definitely a man.
I also want to say that it does like, it really depends on how you want like the reader to engage, because it had me asking me questions about my own biases. Like, I'm like, am I confused about this person's gender because I'm seeing them being a caretaker at first, and so I'm assuming that they're a woman, but then it doesn't really fall in that. And then the stuff with the Facebook was like, wait, but So I am not, it was distracting to some level, but it allowed me to like, I had to ask questions about my own way of thinking. So, just offering that.
Yeah, I think it's a compelling kind of question. I'm gonna stop us here so we can move on with the time we have to free write. But I want to say that I think these questions are distractions when we're reading. And so part of the writer's role is to figure out if it's worth it to you. Like, do you want this to be like, if the piece is concerned with gender norms, then that's a good thing to do, to like frustrate us a little bit at the beginning to show us that like we're caught up in the patriarchy, but also like know that it's a distraction. And so it's like any distraction, any question we have, it raises like an expectation, but also makes us aware of the piece. It like takes you out of it. So as we're working, and Sherry, it's not picking on you because this is really not like that big of a deal, honestly. Like I wouldn't have stopped reading this because I didn't know if it was a male or a female in the first, few hundred words. But like part of what I want you to consider is that for some people, in some situations, in some stories, in some books, like the frustration will have a person put the book down, put the story down, or like take a break to go to the bathroom, So like part of what we're trying to figure out is how to like have questions that serve our work. And if the question we want to serve our work is one where we're confronting some hidden bias within the reader, then it's a really good question. Okay, so Sherry, anything else from you or?
No, but that's interesting just because I had taken this course with Garth Greenwell just recently, and so this has been on my mind a lot about when the gender is revealed, because of biases. So maybe that's why I'm in this frame of mind of like, when is it neutral, and then when does it start becoming more gendered, and what is the balance of how far can you get away with it before readers start asking, oh, who is this? Is this a male or a female? Is this someone in the spectrum? Like all of that. So that's good for me to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, especially if it's a concern of yours within the body of your work. I think it's even more important to be intentional about it.
Yeah, and just because a lot of my work does deal with consciousness and how perception shapes reality. So that's something that I'm thinking about a lot.
Yeah. All right. So what we're gonna do now, we're gonna use the last 20 minutes of this hour to free write. So let me give you like your next prompt, and Sherry's the only one that's gonna be working on third prompt because the rest of you bums didn't do this. I'm kidding. Jennifer said she did do it. She said she just didn't send it. So I mean, like what I'd like you to do, I'm gonna just give you writing prompt number 3 to remind you what writing prompt number 2 was. Let me jump to that one real quick. 2 was write the next scene from a different perspective. So you want to like move the story forward however you want to move it, but like do it from like a changing point of view, whether it's a different character or like first to second to third, whatever. And then for the third prompt, I want us to escalate the situation. And actually, for those of you that are going to be working on the prompt for like the second prompt, you can actually do 2 and 3 together. You can like shift the point of view and then have a moment of an escalating situation from the first character, the ghost. Now you're going to move either to another character in a different point of view or just to another character with the same point of view. And I want you to like go to town. I mean, I really want you to consider how you're going to escalate whatever choice you've made. And I want you to be conscious of like whether it's an emotional, spiritual, or physical type of escalation. The last thing that I want to say is that it would be ideal Was I sharing my desktop or no? I was like, what's happening here? Why aren't you seeing? If I put this thing about getting us, positioning us for like the last week, which is like this would be the last section of the story we would read for next week. So when you get to writing prompt number 3, you're kind of like in some ways tightening or wrapping up just for this class, because it's the last time we're going to read it. So, and hear from you. So what I want you to think about is whether or not there's a way to surprise the ghost. Like, is there a way in which this concept of surprise, which we started with, the ghost is coming back to haunt our wrongdoer and is doing something to that wrongdoer that the wrongdoer does not expect? And then by the end, is there any way that we can surprise the ghost? Is there like, sorry, let me, I'm gonna stop sharing. So, so just, I don't wanna make it too complicated, obviously, but if it feels like a natural thing for you to do through your escalation process, that you can inject some kind of, it's like a neat way to wrap something up, to have something really unexpected happen. And we're going to come back on here at 12:05. So like 5 minutes after, the next hour. So right now it's 11:42 here. I'm gonna be back here at 12:05. And those who would like to share are welcome to share, okay? 1 more minute. All right, let's come back. I'm very hungry, so I'm gonna mute myself as you guys read. The best part of doing free writing is that more often than not, you know what you want to keep doing. I'm sorry, it's allergies. They drive me crazy. So I hope you're all in a roll now and you're gonna like really use the momentum from the free writing exercise to like finish up strong for next week, and that you're all gonna send me your stories on Friday. So let's start. Who wants to go first? Jennifer, Angela, are you guys back? Angela, you want to go first? You don't want to go first? It's okay. You're muted, so I can't hear you. But I'm assuming by your facial expressions.
Oh, I'm too new at this. You'll get me next week, I promise. This was a great exercise though.
Okay, Jennifer, you want to go? You gotta be brave, people. Come on.
Yeah, I'll read it really quickly. So this is like the second perspective, and I'll just read it. And the working title for this is The Boy. The changes started happening last year, but he still hadn't told anyone. He didn't know how he would explain such a thing, nor did he think that anyone would believe him. At first, it all seemed kind of silly. He would find small, fuzzy feathers on his clothing, on his bed. But he figured one of the chickens was trying to nest in his room. His grandfather allowed him to have free range of the house, and they often nested on living room furniture, so it wouldn't be too strange. But soon after, the skin on his hands and feet became dry and flaky, with a burning itch that only seemed to get worse, even with all the remedios that his grandmother made for him. After scratching layers deep into a pink, tender, useless state, he didn't think it could get worse. But then the pain came. He was crouching in the back of his grandfather's truck, trying to avoid the sticky mess oozing out of the fermenting cacao as they made their way to La Junta. He felt a sudden tingling sensation on his left shoulder, but just as soon as he noticed, the pain grippled his shoulder like a hungry vulture. Un pájaro malo, pecking his bones so loudly that he forgot where he was. His ankles gave out beneath him as he fell into the middle of the sticky, wet cacao, and the smell, that rancid, sour smell, filled his entire body until he could hold it no longer. He was still laying in his own vomit, immobilized by the pain, when his grandfather came around the truck to check on him. He saw his yellow eyes grow dark through the haziness as the deafening pain dissipated and the voice of the man began to get louder. All 400 kilos of cacao had to be tossed. Even though his grandfather didn't say anything, he could feel how upset he was. It had been hard enough finding men to work the cosecha, and now he had no money to pay them. I'll stop there because I just was.
Wow, that's like fascinating. Wow. And the writing is gorgeous, Jennifer. Wow, it's really beautiful.
Thank you.
What is he turning into? I want to know. Okay, so do you want to be involved in the conversation? I'm just gonna, these are gonna be shorter than like the last time. We're gonna do 5 minutes of just conversation about the piece, okay? Because I want to make sure everybody has a turn to go. Do you want to be quiet or do you want to be active?
I mean, if you guys have questions, I want to listen to what you guys have to say first. But if there are because it's like a snippet in the middle of the whole thing, so I understand that there's like no context for what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenging piece, but we can tell you what we think is interesting, and then what questions we have, and also like maybe reader expectations might be helpful for you since you're working on something a little longer.
Yeah.
So okay, let's start. So who wants to go first? What do we have in terms of what we admire or appreciate about the piece?
I love the vivid descriptions. It was really fascinating what was happening, and I wanted to know also what would happen to him and who he was. Actually, I wanted to know who this boy was, and well, for me with this snippet, it was just very easy to imagine what was happening to him. We just don't know what it is, but it was quite vivid.
Do we just jump in?
Yeah, I'm gonna eat, so you guys go for it.
Only if you fax us some. Anyway, for me, because her images were so evocative, I remember I was able to retain more of the story, and I was immediately put on location, a farm. The grandfather has chickens. He's also growing a product for sale, and the character is being haunted or inexplicable things happening to him that are manifesting in his skin. So I could see all that and be quite interested in what's going to happen next.
Yeah, it's very atmospheric. So there's a lot of Gothic elements. I'm just, yeah, so I can't say more than that because I want to know what happens next.
Can I ask like what a bit of the context?
So this character is actually by the time I reach this part of the point, he's dead. So this is kind of like me going back and like going and telling the story of how he got to that place. And so this is originally a story about a little girl and who gets like these weird powers after she has her first period. And so she gets taken through like a portal where she gets kind of put into this parallel world, and she like witnesses this little boy's murder, and she's kind of supposed to save him but doesn't. And so now I was stuck there because I'm like I don't know what to do. So going back and doing the second assignment, I wanted to go deeper into the boy, and this is just what came out so far. But he's transforming, and he's like basically a shapeshifter, and he's going through like a really painful physical transformation that is also gonna like take him through like learning about his own culture and like ancestry and stuff like that.
Oh, that's so fascinating. I mean, so one thing that I would say, Jennifer, is as like the physical description, it's really strong. The language is alive. I mean, I was right there. And the part that to me feels a little bit like you need to put more attention into is the like interior thoughts and feelings. Like is he scared? is he, I know he's very self-conscious about the grandfather, and like, it sounds like a little bit of shame that he's brought misfortune, you know, by way of like financial, but I want to know like emotionally how he's feeling, because if puberty comes through, are there other shapeshifters in the world? Has he ever witnessed anybody else doing this? Because if not, then this shock is like, am I dying? Because I'm like, if my skin is like pus and all these different things, immediately I would be like, I mean, if I live in a farm, I know what a sick animal looks like when it's about to die. So I think just like connecting the interior thoughts to emotions more so. I mean, I think you nailed the descriptions.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
What else, folks? We got a few seconds. See, you did. I mean, you did fantastic. Nobody even had any questions or suggestions, just me being like. So, okay, who wants to go next? Oh, Jennifer, is there any other final thoughts you want to say? Or
No, thank you. That was really helpful. I'm glad the description works.
all right, I'm just gonna pick people. So, Cherise, why don't you go?
Okay, just to recall, the first piece was this ghost was in the kitchen and she was hating on this woman who was in the kitchen. So okay, that's where I come in again. Why are you gone? I let myself in your house. You gave me the keys, remember? I find myself walking through your kitchen. I never told you, I guess, but I was always impressed with how you kept everything clean all this time. I never told you many things. Now I can't. I go over the photos on your fridge, the full life you've had. Dan, Kay, those smiling faces. Kay will miss you. I touch your face in the photo, on the photo, but it's not at all like touching you. I miss you, Sheila. There's a full plate of pancit in the fridge. I remember how much you liked this. I remember the times we'd share a full plate and gossip about the neighborhood, about old friends, about our mothers. If I taste a bit of this, if I eat some of this, pretend like it was before, will I feel you with me again? And so I didn't finish the third prompt exercise, but I go back to the perspective of the ghost. And so, well, it's a bit rough. I watch you work your mouth through the huge forkful of pancit you just shoved in. I'm trying to focus all my energies. Dear God, help me kill her. Just this one thing. Imagine being in your throat, to be so intimate. Die, just die. I hear a sound. Dear God, you're choking. You cough out the pancit, the plate clatters to the floor, and it's a huge mess. But that's not what I see because you're sobbing. You're down on your knees. You can breathe now, but you're crying. I don't understand. I really never understood you, Eve.
Mm. Yeah, that was really striking. I think the fact that there's such tenderness in the second character and so much love is very striking, that we have this ghost filled with raging hatred. That works really well. Okay, what other compliments, praise, what do we have?
I really wanted to give you credit on the continuity, you know, because I remember your story previously, and then just where we are, and then it's so interesting because in this reading and hearing the perspective of the woman who is choking, I realized how much I was taking the ghost side, you know, that she's been wronged, and then to have this perspective from the person who is choking with all this tender memories of that other woman who passed, it gives me pause and makes me question, like, well, yeah, then who's right? What happened? Why does she have this tender feeling towards her, whereas the other woman hates her to the point where she's coming back from the dead to kill her,
Yeah, there's a lot of tension. I mean, Jennifer, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I think that this adds like so much more complexity to the characters and the situation, because now it's not like the ghost is just upset at someone who did something bad to them. Like we don't know, right? Like we don't know what's happening. We don't know if the ghost has misinterpreted the situation or the relationship. Like it's so much deeper now. And then one thing that I did notice too is that like you get it's so into like the minute details with the ghost, but the other character is experiencing things really differently too. So yeah, that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, I really liked the second part. It brought like such an element of surprise for me because it was so unexpected, but really complicates their relationship. Um, and yeah, it introduces this tension where I'm wondering, well, how did they get to this point where they feel this way for each other? Such a disconnect. I'm wondering, like, what's going to happen? Like, how is this story going to unfold? It immediately makes me want to keep reading.
Yeah, it's very charged, Charisse. I think it's really intelligently constructed because there's like a mystery that's the seed, right? And we're gonna keep reading to find out. So I mean, you can take it anywhere. Charisse, do you have questions for us about any aspect of it?
Well, actually, because now it's really tense and this is a prompt, so I'm normally outline, and this is something that I just pull out now. So I feel a bit stuck and to sustain it. So but well, I have one more week to see what I can do about this. So I will take all these points that you've given and see how to sustain it and also clean up the language and everything. But it's always been this problem with me. It's sustaining. You can start strong and then somehow at some point it's not sustainable. So I'm trying to watch out for this.
Well, so I mean, I don't know that sustainability is a concern we need to have. I think I don't think that like a narrative needs to maintain the same level of tension or the same level of dynamic. I don't even know what that word is. Dynamicism. Is that a word? But you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think that needs to be the pressure you're putting on yourself. I think like, there are questions, like part of what I want you to consider for like the last part of this prompt, and then you can expand it. I mean, if you want to make this story a 10,000 word story, you can. I wanted you to understand the components you need to establish to make like an interesting, compelling piece of fiction, prompted by the prompts, but like you do whatever you want from this point forward, right? So like, I would invite you to consider like, what does each character, we'll talk about this next week, but like, what does each character want? Do they get it? And is there resolution? Does the character get transformed by it? Is there like a point of transformation for the ghost? Is there a point of transformation for this other ghost, for the person that's alive? I think there are questions that you have laid open for us that are very tense filled. So our expectation is that those questions are going to be answered. Like, what happened to her? How did she die? And did this woman kill her? Because in the first section, I remember that she thinks this woman killed her. And so now we are confronted with someone who's like very tender and who loves her. And now we're thinking the ghost is unreliable. right? So you gotta like kind of work that out for us in the next section. And I mean, I think that's like a really interesting, fascinating thing, because it doesn't have to be neat. It doesn't have to be like this kind of bow at the end. It can just be like the ghost is tormented, the ghost is wrong. Like that can be the story, you know? Or the story can be, this woman is a maniac, you know? She did kill somebody and she's in complete denial. That's a story, you know? So I think just make some choices and do your best, but don't put pressure on yourself that like paralyzes you from writing. That's not what we want. Katrina, you want to go?
Sure. Okay, so just a refresher, the first part was the cop and the Queen Amon looking at a coroner, eating it. Okay. When you get your first period, smear the blood on your face so you don't get pimples. You'll break up if you and your partner eat from the same plate. Cutting nails during the full moon brings bad luck. Say tao po when you knock on a door to let them know you're human. Lola was the one who believed in superstitions, not me, but I sure know about them. When I was young, I would just do whatever she told me to do. I felt I had to because she was just so old. I must have believed the superstitions and ghost stories at first, but at some point, real life came along and I didn't have enough room in my head to mind the supernatural stuff. I still do things when I visit her as a sign of respect, not because I actually think something bad is going to happen if I don't. So when I started to believe that it was a ghost that was ruining my dates, I thought I was going outright mad. At 1 o'clock, I told my colleagues I was going out for lunch. They waved and didn't look up from their monitors. When I walked into the cafe, I took my phone out and opened Tinder. Green beanie, Gravity's Rainbow. I saw him sitting at a small table texting on his phone, Thomas Pynchon's book off to the side. Oliver? Yeah, he pulled his beanie down a bit, stood up and quickly looked me up and down. Emma, right? Gabrielle. Oh, right, sorry. He had a weird metallic smell to him. That was all I got.
Oh, that's all you got? Okay. Jennifer, you ready? Okay. I was like, oh, we're jumping at the chat. Katrina, so first of all, like I love how like all of you are doing this so differently. This is so joyful for me because everybody's just like, I mean, you're also talented. You're making me feel like a very good teacher. Like I'm like, check me out, taking all the credit. I love that this character, the new perspective, is actually thinking about the ghost. Like I love that the character is aware there's a ghost. And I love the idea that like at first I thought I was going crazy, but I'm not crazy. There's really a ghost because we as the readers know there is a ghost. So I just think there's something that's really brilliant about that, about just putting it out there. And I'm also really interested. I feel like it's gonna be very interesting, like because now we know there's like a series of things that have happened with dates, and it's a perfect seed for escalation. Because the dates have been getting ruined. So now we can't wait to read to see how the next dates are going to be ruined. Right. So it's like a very smart way to think about this idea of escalation and how we take it from there. What else do we want to offer, Katrina?
Oh, I just wanted to add that because now there's a little bit more context, right? And the character basically, now I'm very curious about how the character is going to take the grandmother's side and like, oh, I should believe that there are ghosts or shouldn't I? So I'm very curious if there's going to be that kind of internal conflict about this isn't real. No, this is very real. You know, like that type of interplay. I'm very curious how that's going to be presented throughout the subsequent installments.
Yeah, the whole intergenerational thing. I was in another workshop where, you know, I believe in ghosts. Like I come from a culture where like it's just like ghosts are hanging around, and sometimes they're evil, sometimes they're not. And I was having a conversation in like this kind of very Euro-centric workshop. And I swear somebody's eyes popped out. Like I went from being a very respected and esteemed member of the workshop to people looking at me like I was a little nuts. So I love that you said that, Sherry, because I think it is like there's so many different ways that people think about ghost stories and whether or not ghosts are real. And so anyway, what else do we want to offer Katrina?
I also wanted to praise the details again that she puts in this piece, and especially because for me, it again brings me back because I heard about this, but your first period, putting the blood on your face. I didn't do it, but it was funny, and for me, of course, very relatable. And also in terms of escalation, yes, I agree very much. You want to find out. And also I want to know why the ghost is haunting her, because Gabrielle sounds like a nice person. I mean, why would a ghost want to bully her or whatever it is that this ghost is trying to ruin her life? So I'm very curious, did she do something?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it now, right? Twice. And it's a really good point of tension. It works, it makes us now want to stop reading when there's like the story is telling us two very different things. There's two different realities at play. And it's really fascinating to see that be answered.
Well, I wasn't sure whether to make her like an unlikable character. I was thinking about doing it, and then I felt like bad, and I sort of just like made her nicer. But I feel like I started out wanting to make her unlikable, and she didn't turn out that way.
Yeah, I don't know. It might serve the story for her to be nicer, or for us to start out thinking she's nice and then for her to not be that nice.
Yeah.
Like you can subvert our expectations in like that way. You can just make up your mind. That's a playful way to do it. Because sometimes the characters lie to us. I mean, the main character in my novel, my goodness, she was lying for me. And I was like, wait a minute, I made you up. How are you lying to me? It's like you're a figment of my imagination and you tricked me for like 12 years. So sometimes they lie to us and we got to dig real deep. So do we have any like immediate questions or reactions that we want to offer Katrina for this piece?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by the way that your story moves and the format, like the shape of it. One, I think there's like a lot of poetry in your writing, which is really beautiful and like really gets you like in there. But I like how you move from like the small details and then you pan out and then you get like this bigger perspective and more context as you move further along. So that just stands out to me, and I'm like, this is so juicy. Like, I'm here for the format.
I'm curious about what the stakes are for Gabrielle. Like, is there a guy, for example, that she really likes, and then she's like, oh my God, this cannot happen right now. I'm curious whether it escalates to that later. Like, what does it mean for the haunting to happen, and then how does that affect her personal life, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think this concept of stakes, and we're gonna spend like the first part of next week doing a little bit of a chat about character, and so it'll be really good too what you can carry forward after that, because I do think that there's a way in which characters have to want things, even smaller characters. And we'll be talking a lot about that because that's another point of like tension and escalation, is like whether or not we give characters what they want. Katrina, do you have any questions or any thoughts for us?
No, not at this time. Thank you so much for the feedback.
Yeah, I love smaller classes. See how intimate and wonderful this is? I mean, I also like the bigger classes, but I, for one, I'm someone who's like the smaller the class, the more meaningful it feels like you can really get into it, you know? So thank you so much for your attention. Angela, you're like a rock star for showing up at 7 in the morning. So all of you on like all these different time zones, I'm so impressed that you've like held on for the class. Next week will be our last class. So I'm so excited to like spend our last class together. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. And please do the assignment so that we can look at your work and give you some feedback. I really want you all to have something you can keep working on. And Angela, for you, that can also mean just give us something from like your memoir. If you want to really work on something, and just remember to inject some of the techniques we've been talking about, sensory details, point of view, changing the point of view. I mean, those are all things that people do in creative nonfiction. So I don't want you to feel like you have to go off and like write something completely different than what serves you in your work. But I also want you to participate. So if this is like a playful way in which you're trying to get into fiction, then get into fiction. But let's commit to doing the work.
I have written something. I'm just gun shy. I will perfect it, and trust and believe it will be up next week.
Okay, great.
I'll even go first.
Well, I cannot wait. I'm very excited about that. And no pressure either, because I can tell you that all of my first drafts are like trash. So I'm so impressed with all of you. Charisse, hi.
I have a question. So for next week, do we just improve on these things and submit to you, or do we add to it? Or
yeah, so it's, you know, there's 3 prompts for this class. You'll have the 3 prompts. I'll email the 3rd prompt just for everybody to have it, because some folks didn't show up. What I would say is, like, what I want you to do for next week is to really think about like the narrative shape, you know, like, so now that we're like in the 3rd week, I want you to think about like plot, like what's happening here, and like, have you done what you need to do to carry the plot forward? And I want you to think about escalation, like something has to happen in the story, and I want to be able to like tell that something is happening. And you know, for me, like, because this doesn't need to be neat or ended by next week, but I want it to be like clear that you've employed these different craft techniques we've been learning. Next week, we'll be talking about character and how to complicate your characters. And we can also spend a little bit of time talking about endings. For those of you that want to then take, I'll bring you a final prompt for week 4 that you can do like after the class. And I'm going to invite you guys to share with your writing buddy. So that you guys can be accountable to each other and hopefully keep working, okay? All right, well, have a wonderful week. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. This has been so rich.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
amazing.
I'm glad you're still enjoying it. Okay, good day.
Bye.
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 Bye, everyone.